Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Carlisle, one of your pastors here. I had a good week. Did you have a good week? Yeah, actually, on Saturday, I began the 34th year of my marriage. That's kind of a cool thing. And because I'm such a giving and selfless husband, I've given my wife my cold that I've been suffering with for about 14 weeks. We came to the paint night on Friday night. Thanks, Patty. We both painted the same picture, but in our own versions. And so people have been asking what we did with the pictures. So I went home, and because I'm already bragging about myself so much, I am such a great husband, I took those pictures and put them underneath our vows, right on our dresser that we have up hanging on our walls. Isn't that so romantic and stuff? Yeah. It's kind of cool because it expresses our individuality and the same picture done different ways. So that has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I just wanted to tell you about how my week was. If you don't mind doing me a favor, you got a packet when you came in. In that packet is a communication card. So we'd love to hear from you. If, as we're going through the morning, if something strikes you, something you hear, something God brings to mind, a feeling, an emotion, or something that you would like us to pray with you about, then take that card out and just write a word or two down. You don't have to describe it in great detail. We have a prayer team that we would send that out to unless you mark confidential, and they'll just pray. No one's going to contact you unless you ask us to. But that's a way for us to be articulate with what God is doing in our lives. So, question for you. How much of a strategizer in life are you? Are you more of a free-flow person? You just kind of handle things as they come to you, more easygoing? That's not me at all. I'm not one of those people. I am highly strategic. In fact, a number of years ago, one of my bosses at the time told me, and I wasn't sure if it was a compliment, that I was the most strategic person that he had ever met. And I was like, is that like on my strength side or my weakness side? It's actually a strength of mine. And when I do life coaching, I talk to people a lot about a thing called Strengths Finders, stuff in this book and another book, and it tells you what your strengths are out of a big list of 56 different strengths. It gives you your top 5. One of my top strengths is strategy. So this is what it says about people like me. The strategic thing enables you to sort through the clutter and find the best route. This perspective allows you to see patterns where others simply see complexity. Mindful of these patterns, you play out alternative scenarios, always asking, what if this happened? Okay, well, what if this happened? This recurring question helps you see around the next corner. There you can evaluate accurately the potential obstacles. Guided by where you see each path leading, you start to make selections. You discard the paths that lead nowhere. You discard the paths that lead straight into resistance. You discard the paths that lead into a fog of confusion. You cull and make solutions until you arrive at the chosen path, your strategy, as I smile. Armed with your strategy, you strike forward. This is your strategic theme. What if, select, and strike. So today we're talking about another guy, Jacob, in the Old Testament, in the Bible, that if he were to take this assessment, I know for sure that one of his strengths would be the strategic strength, because his life was just full of one strategy thing after another. So before we jump into the scripture that we're going to jump into in a couple of minutes, I want to give you the pre-story before I read to you the verses that we're going to look at today. So Jacob, a word that could describe his life as wrestling. Strategic wrestler. So he started wrestling in the womb. He had a twin brother, Esau, and it says that in the womb they jostled about. They wrestled with each other in the womb. And when Esau and Jacob were born, Esau was born first barely, and Jacob was grabbing onto his heels as if he was trying to pull him back so that he could get out first. In fact, that's what his name means, one who grasps at the heel, or one who replaces. And that became his life. Through manipulation, through deceit, he stole his brother's birthright. You can read that story. His brother was a hunter and was hungry, and Jacob was more of the mama's boy. He was home cooking, and he made this savory stew, and his brother traded his birthright for it. When it came time to get a blessing, which was a big deal in those days, Jacob's mother helped him trick his father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing when it was actually Esau's blessing to get. That didn't go so well for Jacob. His brother got super upset because he couldn't get the blessing and it was actually supposed to be his. And he wanted to murder his brother. A little bit of family drama. His mother, who had helped all this dysfunctional stuff come about, said, you need to escape. Your brother's going to kill you. I can't live with that. So go be with my brother, his uncle. So he flees off to his uncle's land to escape being murdered by his twin brother. He falls in love with a girl who happens to be his cousin. That wasn't so bad back in those days because it was more of the family stump wasn't stunted down. It was still growing, so it was okay to marry your cousin, and he wanted to marry her, but he had to barter, like sell himself, to be able to marry her. That was the custom of the day, so he worked for 7 years before he could marry the love of his life, Rachel. And so his new father-in-law tricked him because the custom, the father-in-law said, of our people is that the oldest daughter marries first. So unbeknownst to Jacob, until that night, he discovers that he had married his love's sister, another cousin, but it was not the one he wanted to marry. So he goes to his father and said, dude, what'd you do to me? You knew who I loved. He said, well, it's the custom. If you wanted to marry Rachel, I'll let you marry her, but you have to work for another 7 years. So he basically went into debt so that he could get the love of his life. So he was romantic in his own way too. So he settled into married life. It was full of dysfunction, the sister wives thing. The sister wives had maid servants. There was dysfunctionality with infertility. So the sister wife said, hey, why don't you make babies with my maid servant? So he did that, and so he had a bunch of kids. Lots of family drama. Strategic guy. He was successful as a herdsman, a businessman. He was successful. He was so successful, his herds got so big that he was outgrowing the land of his father-in-law, and he needed to go to a new land so that he could continue to be a profitable businessman. So he wanted to go back to his homeland with all of his family, all of his kids, and his maidservants, and all of his herds. But in order to get to the land of his family, he had to pass through the land of his brother. His brother also was now very successful. So he wanted to pass through. He was the ultimate strategist. So he said, I'm going to kind of work this, massage this thing, try to help my brothers, let bygones be bygones. So he gathers herds together and a bunch of other stuff, and he tells his servants to go to his brother Esau and say, here's some gifts from your brother, because he loves you, not because he's trying to buy your gratitude and so you don't kill him. And so then he works another plan over here, where he takes his wives, maidservants, and kids, and some other goats and stuff, and then he sends them on a different way, so that if his brother, his murderous brother, comes to try to kill him and his people, he would have a 50-50 chance that his family would survive. So his servants come back, and they say, your brother is on your way to see you. He didn't know what his brother was going to do. So that's now where we're caught up to the story. He's been working several different angles all at once. And so then he comes to a place where he camps for one night by himself. So Genesis 32, I'll give you a second to turn to that. It'll also come up on the screen. I'm going to read the story about Jacob's wrestling match with God. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go until you bless me. A big obsession of Jacob's. He wanted to get blessed by everyone. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for these stories of people that encountered you. We ask today that we would be those people, that our story would encounter you. And that as we think about wrestling with you, that you would talk to us about the things, the way that you talked to Jacob about his life. Help us to see patterns in our life, particularly those patterns that aren't aligned with you and your plan for us. So we anticipate, God, even wrestling a little bit this morning with you, and as we go from here, to be changed people. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. All right, so I see a few things in this story. There's only 4 of them that I see. The first one is God sometimes takes the initiative to wrestle with us. God sometimes takes the initiative to wrestle with us. That's one of my favorite things about God, is God is the great initiator. He's the one that always comes to us. He's both proactive and reactive. He comes to us where we are, and he works with what we have and what we've done, and he tries to do something. That's what happens here. It says this man, this God, his God, comes to him. Jacob did not seek out this wrestling. This wrestling came to him. So who initiated that? It was God. God does that. Just like God did with Adam and Eve in the garden. Who came to them in the garden? God came to them. Just like God does with you on the cross, as he comes to you as Jesus to the cross. So when you think about your relationship with God, when you think about how much of a strategizer in life you are, and how your strategy and your relationship with God come together, are you like a little bit like Jacob? Are you only sort of partially trust God? You only partially trust God's goodness? And so you always are working the contingency plan, send your family off this way, send your servants off this way, working 2 or 3 different angles just to make sure that your plan goes the way that you want it to go. And then you and God are good as long as God comes through with his part. Unfortunately, as a strategist, that's how I can be sometimes. Have you ever thought maybe that as God initiates wrestling matches with you, that he's trying to change you? That there's purpose behind this wrestling match? That as you are presented with the challenge and you manipulate and you strategize and you work your angles, that you kind of do the same thing over and over again in life. And sometimes God comes to us and says, Carlisle, it's time that you use a new methodology. You're wrestling a little too much. You're wrestling with me, and it's time that we change it up a little bit. And what I love about God in this story and in my life is that he is the one who initiates with me. He comes to me and says, hey, let's have a little wrestling match. And when you come out of the end of this wrestling match, you're going to be a little different if you get what I'm trying to do with you. So the first thing that we can be grateful about in wrestling matches with God, rather than getting upset about it, is that God has something better in store for us, and he takes the initiative to wrestle with us. After that, God wrestles with us to help us with our past, our present, and our future. Do you remember as a kid how fun it was to, sorry, there must be nailing on the wall over there. Give your attention. All right, now back here. Okay, we're together now. Do you remember how fun it was to wrestle as a kid, particularly as a boy? I loved wrestling as a boy. I was a middle boy of 3 boys in the family that I was raised with, and I loved wrestling with my brothers. I loved wrestling with my dad, my adopted dad. It seems more often than not when I wrestled with my 2 brothers as the middle child that they would always gang up on me. Middle children always get ganged up on. Don't we? Don't we? That's kind of how life is. My brothers would gang up on me. But I don't know if you've noticed, I'm just a little on the spastic side. Just a little spastic. I always have been my whole life. So when my brothers would wrestle with me and gang up on me, they actually had a hard time keeping me down. I was pretty lanky, so it wasn't a matter of muscle. It was a matter of spasticity. I practiced that word. It was a matter of me just being spastic. So one of the last times I saw my 2 brothers, the last time that we wrestled together was about 33 years ago. Actually, 34. It was before I was married, now that I think about it. I was in college at that time. I was 18 years old. My older brother was 22. My younger brother was 14. And we came together and we were wrestling, and it was the same old thing. They were ganging up on me, and I had a little more muscle than length then. They couldn't keep me down because I was way too slippery. I was just way too spastic. It's kind of a memory for me, but it's sort of a bitter memory, because it was actually a wrestling match, a real one, but it was a crosswords for me because, like I said already, I've only been with my brothers twice, all 3 of us together since then, and it's been over 33 years. It was a weird convergence of our past, of our present, and our future. We were trying to grab onto the carefree days of when we wrestled, because the reason we were together was because our father that we had in common, my older brother and my adopted father, my younger brother's biological father, was killed unexpectedly, and it was after the funeral. And we were trying to cling to the carefree days of our youth when we would wrestle with him. We would wrestle with each other. We didn't know that our future was about to dramatically change. This wrestling match confronted us. That's how it is, I think, with wrestling matches with God. Usually these wrestling matches with God are unexpected. They're not things that we set into place, or it would be our strategy that puts them there. We don't expect them. We just find ourselves in the middle of them. And they usually confront something from our past because God is trying to challenge us to a different future, and it hijacks what we're presently in. And that's what happened with Jacob. Jacob had a past. It was pretty checkered. He was a manipulator. He was a deceiver. That was his MO. That's how he got by. And God was trying to change that. In his present, it was changing. He was leaving the land of his father-in-law, the land of his wives and maidservants, and going back to his land, and things had shifted. He wanted a more secure future, and there was this barrier that he had to try to get around, and he was strategizing to get around. It was Esau, his brother. So he was using what he was used to doing. He was doing what he always had done, strategizing, manipulating, tricking, trying to trick his brother by splitting up his people. It wasn't different from anything. He was using his power, and he was using his money, which was his great herds, to try to get a positive outcome for what he wanted. He was doing what he had practiced doing. So another little wrestling story, Carlisle wrestling story. So I actually wrestled in junior high for part of a season. It was like, I'm a quitter when it comes to wrestling. I only did part of the season. What was interesting to me, I enjoyed the practice because we would do these drills over and over again. And it seemed repetitive, and I got a little bored because, being spastic, you usually have ADD too. So I would practice all the drills, and then I went to my first wrestling match, and I won. And everyone thought, oh, cool, maybe he's like a wrestler. And the second match I lost, and the third match I lost. So what would happen when I would go to these wrestling matches? Did I tell you I was spastic when I wrestled? So I would practice the drills. We'd practice the drills at practice. When it came to the energy of an actual match, I would forget about the drills, and I'd just be spastic. And it just wasn't working out, and I didn't think it was a good use of my time, good strategy. So I quit wrestling. When it came down to a real match of wrestling someone that knew the skills and knew the drills and could do the drills, I couldn't compete. I just wasn't any good at it. I was just spastic. I think that when it comes to God, we can be like spastic Carlisles, spastic teenagers, because God's got a good plan. God made the drills. He knows how to respond to the situations that we bring up and that others bring up. And when we try to wrestle with God, it's just kind of like a spastic teenager trying to wrestle with the God of the universe. So what we can start to do when we think about wrestling matches with God is we can see it as an opportunity for us to be less spastic, an opportunity for us to grow ourselves into what God wants us to grow into, an opportunity to try different methods, different strategies, to not use manipulation, a new way to trust God for his plan and for his outcome in our life. Jacob, as I mentioned as I was reading, had a regular spastic thing that he did, this regular obsession in his life. Anyone that he encountered up to this point that had more power than him, he would seek a blessing from. He asked for blessings, and he asked for blessings, and he asked for blessings, and that's exactly what he did. He was wrestling with this angelic, godly man, and it goes on for all night long, and then he seeks a blessing from that. What I find so intriguing about that is that Jacob already had a blessing in this. He was wrestling for what he already had. Do you ever wrestle with God for what God's already giving you? Because if you trace back this blessing thing that Jacob was obsessed with, it started before he was even born. Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 17, with his grandfather Abraham. God, the great initiator, comes to Abraham and says, hey, I'm going to bless you and your descendants, of which Jacob is one, his great-grandson. I'm going to bless you and your descendants. I'm going to do a thing with your people. I'm going to communicate with the world about me through your people. 2 times he said that to Abraham. And then he comes to Jacob's father, Isaac, in chapter 26, and does the same thing. And he says, the blessing that I gave to your father, I'm giving to you now. Your descendants will be blessed. God initiated that, and then God actually comes to Jacob himself. You know the story that if you ever went to Sunday school and you're growing up, Jacob's ladder? That was before this wrestling match. In chapter 28, Jacob has a dream, a ladder descending into heavens, and angels were coming up and down. And after the angels were descending, God came to him and said, I will bless you and your descendants. So Jacob was already blessed. He was wrestling for what God had already given him. This is what he said, what God said. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord your God, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. What he was questing for, God's already saying, I'm going to give it to you. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. The very thing that Jacob was trying to get blessed, God was already working out for him. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. It's interesting that at this episode of Jacob's life, the pre-wrestling episode, when God says, I'm going to bless you, Jacob goes, cool. If you do that, this is totally Jacob style, strategy style. If you do that, God, then you'll be my God. You won't be my parents' God. This is the first time that Jacob actually has faith in God himself, not because of his parents, but he puts a condition on it. If you do what you said you're just going to do, then I'll worship you, and you'll be my God. God wants more than that from us. He wants us to realize that he's God, whether he delivers what we want him to deliver or not. So wrestling with God is an opportunity to wrestle with ourselves and then to move on to something new, many times that God has already put into place, that he's already blessed us with, and he's already working out. Also, wrestling with God leaves a mark. Wrestling with God leaves a mark. See, it's wrestling, so it's not easy. It's contentious. It's a contest. It's wearying. Wrestling with God wears us out. It's our will against God's will, as if we think we can compete with God, that our will could ever overcome God. And so it says in the text that it gave Jacob a limp. So I think wrestling with God leaves a mark on us. It gives us a limp. It can change us. It should change us. God's trying to change us with these wrestling matches. The way that we walk with him. The way that we walk with life. It helps us remember how we fit into the scheme of God's things, not how God fits into the scheme of our things. So think about some of the wrestling matches that you've had with God and the mark that it's left on you. The way that it's affected not the way you walk physically, but the way that you walk spiritually. I was thinking of some of my wrestling matches that changed my life, that as I was wrestling with God, I was unsure about. I told you about one of them. The wrestling, when my brothers were wrestling, the funeral of my father was murdered. That changed my life. It makes me walk with a limp to this day. I learned things about God. I learned things about me. I learned things about the world that have changed the way that I walk. I thought about the estranged relationship with my family. I haven't seen my brothers, all three of us together in all those years because there's all kinds of weirdness in there. That has changed me. That has affected the way I see the world and the way that I see God and the way I see myself. A more recent one I've shared before, leaving the ministry that I was involved with for over 10 and a half years in East Mesa. And I got to come here to Journey, but there was this in-between time where that was the most intense wrestling with God that I actually felt like Jacob. I was actually wrestling directly with God because I knew what I wanted to be about. And God had something in store that I had a hard time waiting for, and it left a mark to the positive. Losing my friend last summer, a year ago, a 46-year-old good friend of mine died unexpectedly of a heart attack, leaving our other good friend alone to raise their teenage kids. That's one I'm still wrestling with. That's one that I haven't got the mark yet. I don't fully understand. I trust God. I'm trusting God with the lives of my friend's kids and the life of his widow. But we're wrestling a little bit about that. All those things, like Jacob, have caused me to limp. They've left a mark. One's leaving a mark. Some of these limps are temporary, where you just have a hitch in your get up for a month or two. Sometimes it changes the way you walk for the rest of your life. Some days it's not noticeable. Some days it's like arthritic pain when your arthritis flares up because it's too humid outside or something. Sometimes it's like that spiritually or emotionally. But the thing that I trust is that God initiates wrestling matches with me to bring me to a new future, even if it leaves a mark. And the last thing, the positive thing that we see that happened to Jacob is wrestling with God can give us a new name. It can give us a new name. Jacob got a new name. Do you remember what his name meant? The one who grasps with the heels, or the one, it says that supplants, the one who tries to overtake. His new name is, you have wrestled with God and have come through. I was thinking about the timing of this blessing and this new name in this story. I love the timing of this in this story. It wasn't during the struggle that Jacob got the new name. It was when the struggle was over. And you notice who said, okay, buddy, it's time to stop wrestling with me? God did. God, the great initiator, initiated even the end of the wrestling match. That's the first thing I got to remember. When I'm wrestling with God, sometimes I just need to stop wrestling with God. I need to listen when God says, okay, so the sun's coming up now, Carlisle. You've been wrestling with me on this issue too long. Time's up. I'm God. You're not. Stop wrestling. It also hit me that when we are wrestling with God, that is not the time to wonder about his goodness. Because we're in the midst of a struggle. We're in the midst of a scuffle. God is trying to change things. And we should be careful not to wonder about God's goodness, because daybreak came after the struggle. Daybreak always comes. And when the day breaks, when the clouds lift or the darkness lifts, that's when we see God's goodness. That's when we see God's plan. That's when we get a new name for a new situation that God has brought us into. As Jacob left that scene, it's kind of cool. If you read the rest of the story, he goes right into a scene of peace. His brother was not out to murder him anymore. His brother had let bygones be bygones. His brother was happy to see him and wanted to bless him in return. Jacob didn't bring that about. God was already working on that. So when Jacob got his new name, one who wrestles with God and comes through, when he came through, he was immediately already in a place of peace. So is there something that you're wrestling with God about? Maybe a wrestling match that's only been like a night. Maybe it's been a week. Maybe a month. Maybe it's been a bunch of years. Could God be saying to you, okay, buddy, wrestling match is up. It's time for the sun to come up. Quit wrestling with me on this. Let me give you a new name so you can move forward with that. You know the definition of insanity, right? We all know that it's doing the same thing and expecting different results. Sometimes I think that we have an insane view of life and that we have an insane view of God. Because we want life to go differently, but we will not do anything differently. That's insanity. We expect God to change our lives, but we aren't willing to change anything in our lives. That's insanity. That's expecting different things from the same thing that you're doing. We want God to change our lives, but we will not change our relationship with God. We won't trust him more. We won't get to know him more. That, my friends, I think would be a definition of insanity. The series that we're in the middle of, we're looking at opportunities to learn from patriarchs in the Old Testament, people in the Old Testament that God took to a new place. What would be insane would be let those lessons like the one from Jacob to go unlearned. So when it comes to Jacob and wrestling with God, there's 3 quick tips that I want to give to you. When we wrestle with God, we can become bitter or we can become better. Bitter or better. You can choose. You get to choose that. When we wrestle with God, we can become crushed or we can become stronger. Which do you prefer? You want to be crushed or do you want to be stronger? When we wrestle with God, we can give up or we can get through. What's the better outcome? Getting through with a new name. So are you living with some insanity? Are you expecting different things but not doing anything any differently? This is your opportunity to end the wrestling match with God. The worship team is going to come up, and we're going to sing another song, and I want to prepare you for some thinking while that song's coming on. I want you to ponder this question of wrestling with God and coming through with a new name into a new situation. There's a line in the song that I find particularly challenging. I'm just being honest with you. The line is, "You have never failed me yet." I have to admit that when I think about my dead friend, I think about his wife, I think about their teenage kids, sometimes I feel like God may have let him down a little bit. So I'm wrestling with that. I got some news this week about a friend. Bad news. It feels a little like God is kind of letting him and his family down a little bit. I'm wrestling with God this week. So this song is for us to respect God's sovereignty and to rely on his faithfulness. It says that you've never failed me yet. I will trust God in your faithfulness. So there's something that you're wrestling with today. Ponder this song. Daybreak will come. Don't evaluate God's goodness in the wrestling, and trust that he has something better because God is faithful. He has not failed us yet. Listen to this song and worship.